I read 61 books in 2024. These were my favorites. I thought about narrowing them down to 10, but I felt that there was no actual reason for me to do this, so I have 13. I have been ruminating over this list, adding and removing. There are so many books I read last year that I really enjoyed and even loved that are not on this list. These are the books I loved that also did something new or different for me, the ones that I continue to think about far after I finish them. After finishing a book, I always write like a review in my book journal. These are the ones that I looked over while preparing for this video that I felt really excited to talk about. I also don't have any ranking for these. I'm just gonna go in the order that I read them. Starting off very strong, I have Abigail by Magda Szabo. This is the first book I read in 2024, and after I finished reading it, I posted on my Instagram stories that this might be my favorite of 2024, even though it was the first and only book I read at that point last year. This left such a big impression on me, still to this day. If you've never heard of Magda Szabo, I really encourage you to check out her writing. She is a Hungarian author and so underrated in English-speaking countries. Although I have been seeing more of her books around lately, I have read a few of her books now, and Abigail is by far my favorite by her. This is about a stubborn, spoiled, bratty teenage girl named Gina. At the beginning of the story, we see Gina's father taking her to this girls' boarding school that resembles a fortress. It's cut off from the rest of the world, and this is a strict girls' school. All her life, Gina's father has been extremely indulgent with her. She's pretty much been given the world, so as you can imagine, Gina has a difficult time following the school's rules and traditional routines. She's constantly at odds with the staff, and she also doesn't get along with the other girls. She's selfish and she lacks self-awareness. Because of that lack of self-awareness, Gina feels very misunderstood and lonely. That leads us to the eponymous Abigail. Abigail is this stone statue on the school grounds, and there's this mythical lore surrounding Abigail. The lore goes that Abigail has been known to help girls in their moments of crisis. So who does Gina turn to for solace? Abigail. This is a wonderfully moving story about one of the best topics to be explored in literature: girlhood. Gina is unpleasant, yes. She's also lovable and relatable. I think many women and girls can relate to Gina, how sharply and painfully things can be felt in teenagehood. And really, it can be so tumultuous for young people when seeking fulfillment for themselves because they don't know what that looks like yet. They act selfishly. Gina feels she is the center of the world, and she has a really hard time reconciling with the fact that she's not and no one can be. This book also spotlights the father-daughter relationship. It actually reminded me a lot of Bonjour Tristesse by Françoise Sagan. Just like the narrator of that book, Gina wants to go back to the life that she once had with her father. She wants to be lazy and adored. She wants to be a child. But no one escapes the passing of time or major world events. As we get to know Gina and the happenings within the school, we understand that there is a bigger picture that Magda Szabo is weaving outside of the school's fortress. World War II is taking place. It's not about Gina. The Gina we meet at the beginning of the story is not totally different from the Gina that we say goodbye to when we finish the story. However, she does undergo a transformation. This is such a gorgeous coming-of-age story, and I cannot recommend it enough. I do want to add that this NYRB edition compares it to Harry Potter for some reason. I have no idea why. There's really no similarity between this and Harry Potter, besides the fact that they take place at boarding schools. I think it's a big reach. Just in case you read the blurb of this and wonder. Next, I have Annie John by Jamaica Kincaid. There has not been a single piece of writing by Jamaica Kincaid that I have not loved. If you have not read anything by Jamaica Kincaid, you need to find something written by her immediately. Her writing is like butter. It's so smooth and easy to digest. I don't mean that she's writing in a simplistic manner. Her writing simultaneously washes over you like water, but also hits you in the face like a bag of rocks. It is beautiful and silky, but also harsh and rough. She takes these feelings and moments that are really difficult to describe, I feel, but she does it, and with the smoothest language. And it gives you consolation. You're like, oh my god, no one has ever reflected that back to me before. Am I making sense? I just love Jamaica Kincaid. So Annie John is about a little girl named Annie John growing up in Antigua when it's under British rule. It is a very short novella, and just like Abigail, I would say that it centers around girlhood. But in Annie John, we are looking at the mother-daughter relationship. We're looking at it closely with a microscope. We're getting uncomfortably close. So as a very little girl, Annie John worships her mother. She thinks she's the most beautiful woman, the most intelligent. She wants to be just like her when she grows up. But then Annie gets older, and like many teenagers, her feelings start to change. Suddenly, she starts to see her mother in a different light. Their relationship becomes distant, intense, and this is not solely Annie's fault. As Annie is getting older, her mother begins to assume things about Annie. She begins to put these unfair womanly expectations on her. These expectations Annie questions and also deeply resents. At that point, we start to see two emotions juxtaposed with one another: hatred and love, and really how close these two emotions are and how one can veer into the other. In this short novella, Kincaid tackles the complexity of mother-daughter relationships and also how painfully formative experiences in childhood and adolescence can be. And for many women, those experiences are tied to their mother. It's uncomfortable, it's relatable, and with nearly all of Kincaid's work, there is commentary about British colonialism, especially post-colonialism. So Kincaid herself grew up in Antigua when it was under British rule. In the story, Annie John clearly questions and resents Britain's cultural influence, especially in regards to her education. This is a must-read. It's a short read and well worth the time you will spend reading it. Next, I have A Room with a View by E.M. Forster. Let me start by saying that I don't typically read romances. It's not because I'm not like other girls, not at all. The thing is, with many romance stories, there is a lot of angst. And you know what? I think angst is one of the hardest things to depict in writing, but it's one of the most common. In many romance stories, this turmoil and longing sometimes feels a bit overwritten and too indulgent. I think angst delivered with delicacy is the most powerful. Anyways, when I think about myself reading this book, I envision a soft smile being on my face. Thinking about this book is like thinking about the onset of spring. It feels hopeful, wholesome. So the main character is a girl named Lucy. At the beginning of the story, she's vacationing in Italy with a family member. I think it's her cousin. While in Italy, she surrounds herself with other upper-class British families who are also vacationing there. Funnily, they are there to enjoy Italy's weather, the beautiful scenery, but they simultaneously look down on the local Italians, their food, their culture. They're there to enjoy their country, but feel superior to them. Anyways, this trip is basically Lucy's first venture outside of her protected, sheltered life, and she gets to interact with people that she hasn't gotten the chance to back at home. She meets the Emersons, a father-son duo. The Emersons are not the same as the other wealthy British families on this trip. Pretty sure the Emersons are supposed to represent this liberal way of thinking that was beginning to emerge after the Victorian period. So obviously the rest of the British cohort covertly or overtly shun them and think that they're weird. This is such a quiet and understated love story, but it still manages to be incredibly touching and moving. It's beloved by so many people. And you know what? Yes, it may seem like a love story that's been done to death by now, but the execution here is so beautifully done. There are descriptions of flowers throughout. You need to read this in the spring. I just said that I typically don't read romances, and yet I have another one. This is The Kites by Romain Gary. This is a novel translated from French. The main character here is a boy named Ludo, and the story is set in a small town called Cléry, which is in Normandy, France. The story begins before World War II, and it will end after World War II. Ludo, he describes himself as having an excess of memory, which basically means he has a photographic memory. He can remember every detail, every event, every person that he meets, and this is not necessarily a good thing because there are things that Ludo doesn't want to remember in his life. In his childhood, Ludo becomes friends with a Polish girl named Lila. Lila comes from a wealthy aristocratic family, and every summer, her and her family vacation in Normandy, France. Ludo becomes quite close with her family. And then, of course, World War II happens. In retrospect, we know what happened to Poland. We also know what happened very quickly to France at the beginning of World War II. Germany invades Poland, and Ludo loses contact with Lila and her family. Everyone assumes the worst, and then France falls pretty quickly to Germany as well. Horrible things are happening. Ludo needs to think in the present and of the future in order to survive, but he has that excess of memory. He cannot forget about Lila or her family. Ludo's uncle warns him if Lila survives and they can even meet again, she will be different. She will not be the Lila of his childhood. In the same manner, if France ever returns to herself, she will be irrevocably changed. Gary uses a lot of literary elements to get his point across. For example, Lila can be seen to represent France. Also, the characters here are so compelling and some of the most interesting to read. There's this Michelin star French chef. I think he was my personal favorite. I also loved Ludo's uncle and guardian, Ambrose. He is a quirky character who makes these internationally renowned kites. I see this book to be about endurance through hardship. How do people endure? Ludo consoles himself by living in happy memories. Ambrose uses creativity and imagination. The French French chef uses nostalgia through the food that he makes, and it really shows how minuscule choices made by individuals can really serve as huge catalysts. And despite the obviously somber historical setting, this book was extremely funny. There is an excellent balance here. Really happy I read this year, and I really recommend it to you guys. Anyone who loves animals, if you have a pet, a dog, if you have had a pet or a dog, you need to read Flush by Virginia Woolf. If you don't know, Flush was the name of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's beloved Cocker Spaniel. Virginia Woolf wrote his autobiography, so the story is told from the dog's perspective. He tells us about the adventures he goes on, his mishaps. He details the people that he meets, and he makes very shrewd observations on their character and actions. He also makes extremely poignant observations about life, and they're poignant because they're coming from a very simple perspective. Also, if you're a fan of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Flush does detail key moments of her life just from a dog's perspective. I found this book to be so darling and moving. I loved reading about the love and loyalty that Flush had for his human, and also the love that Elizabeth Barrett Browning had for him, how much she depended on him and saw him as her most special companion. I did read this on my Kindle, and I've desperately been trying to hunt down a vintage copy of this book. The older copies, in my opinion, are just so much more precious. Anyways, this is a story that really warmed my heart and I think fondly of, and not one that many people mention when talking about Virginia Woolf, but it is definitely worth appreciating. Next, I have The Vet's Daughter by Barbara Comins. This was a weird little story and I loved it. This was the first book I read by Barbara Comins, and I went on to read more books by her consecutively. I was so in love with her writing. So the main character here is a 17-year-old girl named Alice. She's the daughter of pretty much the worst man on earth. He is horrid to people, including his daughter. And despite being a vet, he is horrid to animals. Alice's father gets this new girlfriend who is equally as horrid as he is, and Alice is forced to become the maid of the house. If you're familiar with Comins' writing, you know that she has a very distinct style. I describe it as very matter-of-fact and upfront, in a way that children can be matter-of-fact. The way that Alice narrates her story feels very childlike and innocent. She recants the happy moments and also the horrid moments in the same manner. It does not feel overly angsty or miserable, it feels astute. At some point in the story, Alice finds out that she has this special ability. I won't say what it is, but it holds a lot of symbolism and significance for Alice. And when Alice's father finds out what she can do, of course, he tries to take advantage of it for his own gain. If you have read The Haunting of Hill House, both Eleanor and Alice serve as very similar characters. They've had this intrinsic loneliness their whole lives. Both of them want to feel normal and be included with whatever normal entails. Over and over, Alice tries to change her circumstances in order to feel at peace, happy, and normal. The ending of this book is deafening. Very similar to the way that Shirley Jackson ends her stories. I would say that this falls under the gothic horror umbrella. Also weird. This is weird girl literature. And I'm usually not a fan of weird books. The weird has to serve a purpose for me. It can't just be weird to call itself weird, or for shock factor. The Vet's Daughter, superb. Everyone please check this out. Next I have Slouching Towards Bethlehem by Joan Didion. This was actually a reread for me, but it still made my favorites last year. However, I don't love all the essays in this specific collection, and not to be sacrilege, but I don't even think all these essays are worth reading. Joan Didion is seen as such an icon that I'm almost scared to say that she's really hit or miss with me. When she does hit though, she is astounding. This specific collection is divided into 3 sections. The first one is The Lifestyles in the Golden Land, which pertains to California in the 1960s. Some essays in that section are about her personal experiences in California, and some are about events and people outside of herself. Thing is, I'm not from California, and I don't feel a personal calling to be from California. However, in that section, I do recommend reading Some Dreamers of the Golden Land. It's a fictional account of Lucille Miller, who was on trial for murdering her husband. If you read that, you should then go on to read the essay, I Thought Joan Didion's Essay Would Ruin My Life. That's written by the daughter of Lucille Miller, Deborah Miller, and it's published in the LA Times. The second section is called Personals, and this is where Joan Didion shines. As you would guess from the title, these are her own personal musings. The essays in this section are phenomenal. If you have not read them, you need to. On Keeping a Notebook, on self-respect, on morality, and on going home, On Self-Respect is life-changing and probably the best piece of writing to ever grace the pages of Vogue. The latter 2 aren't as popular as the first 2 for some reason, but do not skip out on them. And then the last section is called 7 Places of the Mind. These essays are about her experiences in different places. The one I recommend here is Goodbye to All That. It is the last essay in this collection and also my all-time favorite by her. To me, Joan Didion's writing is so memorable because she likes to create these striking lines and she likes to end sections with them. They leave a big impression impression. This essay in particular made me think that Joan Didion must have been so wise and so self-aware, maybe not in those exact moments that she's writing about, but later. And that's very admirable. Yes. Sula by Toni Morrison. Of course, Toni Morrison was going to be on this list. Sula is about Sula and Nell, two young girls growing up together who become very close friends. In fact, they're so close that as children, they have trouble deciphering where one ends and the other begins. However, to the reader, they are very different. As they grow into young women, Sula basically becomes the pariah of the community. She wants to defy societal norms. She's also a bit of an unpleasant person. Nell, on the other hand, chooses to chase normalcy. Sula and Nell's friendship is very complex. And like usual, Morrison has eerie insight and intelligence into the dynamics of their relationship. On top of friendship, this also explores themes of identity, race, community, motherhood. When it came to Sula and Nell's relationship, one of the questions that it raised for me was, are we owed forgiveness? There is a lot more that can be unpacked from this. I feel like it's endless. Whenever I read a Toni Morrison book, I'm reminded again of why I love reading so much. I would say that The Bluest Eye is my all-time favorite by Toni Morrison. However, I get asked quite a lot where to start with Toni Morrison. I do not recommend The Bluest Eye or The Beloved, despite those two being her most well-known. I do think Sula is an excellent place to start. Next, I have The Crucible by Arthur Miller. I really enjoyed this book. Everyone has read this in school, I know. But if you don't know, it's about the Salem, Massachusetts witch trials that occurred in the 1600s. I'm well aware of the criticism aimed at this book, namely that it has a sexist storyline, and I don't think that that criticism is wrong. We have women being accused of witchcraft and condemned to death by a court of men, written by a male author who depicts these female characters in a very sexist, offensive way, and these events actually happened. The joke writes itself. It's also a story about the hypocrisy of peeking into someone else's yard to judge in order to defend yourself from that same judgment. How a seemingly good reputation is more important than being an actual good person. One of the characters, John Proctor, queries why those that are doing the accusing are always assumed to be innocent, why people assume that they're telling the truth. This really highlights how accusations are passed from one person to the next. You find fault in another, you shift attention to them, you feel absolved of your own guilt because you don't have that public judgment. Typical witch hunt. There is also a political agenda behind this book, which you might have learned if you had studied this in school. I think it's about communism, but I do think at least one of the messages is still very much applicable to today. Everyone clean up your own yard. Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh. I could hold forth on this book for a long time. There's so much I could say. So the main character here is named Charles Ryder. He's a middle-class student attending Oxford, and while there he meets the enigmatic, charismatic Sebastian Flight. Sebastian is a very interesting and important character. In the beginning, he comes across as very childlike and almost like this magical creature. Of course, Charles is enamored by him. The two become close and Charles gets to meet the rest of the Flight family. He spends a lot of time at their estate, Brideshead Castle. Through Sebastian, he's invited into this world of old money and decadence. In the first few parts of the story, Sebastian and Charles spend a lot of time alone together at Brideshead Castle, and this is significant because it's like they're away from the rest of the world and their responsibilities. They're living in childhood idealism, but then time passes, they get older, no one escapes that. And in reality, life is not like childhood. People are imperfect and can be cruel, including themselves. All of what I'm saying is the groundwork for the majority of the book. The story actually starts far in the future when Charles is a soldier in World War II. He's with his troop of soldiers and they set up at Brideshead. All the memories come back to him. From the very beginning, Evelyn Waugh alludes to something tragic that has happened between Charles and the Flight family. The reader just doesn't know what that is. And as Charles begins to mull over his memories, the reader gets to meet more members of the Flight family. Okay, so there are strong religious overtones to this book. For example, one section is called A Twitch Upon the Thread, which is referencing like an invisible string between God and his people. Catholicism is a major theme in this book. The notion of good versus bad as dictated by the church has a huge impact on the Flight family and Charles as well. The characters are tormented as they struggle with choosing. The ending of this book reminded me a lot of Go Tell It on the Mountain by James Baldwin. If you read this, By the end of the book, look at where each character has ended up. As the reader, you decide whether or not they chose correctly. The prose is also gorgeous. The literary elements are impressive. I love the symbolism and the foreshadowing. I also love that it kind of mocks itself. The humor throughout is very sharp and self-aware. I haven't read anything else by Evelyn Waugh since, so if you have any recommendations for me, please let me know. Next, Lost Cat by Mary Gaitskell. Before reading this, I did read a few essays by her, but this really solidified my love for her. It's a memoir where she details losing her kitten that she rescued from Italy. She uses that desperate search for her kitten to explore other personal topics, kind of weaving them all together. In particular, she writes about her relationship with different family members and also 2 children that she fosters. Interestingly, she contrasts the way that humans and animals receive love and how we can learn from the way that animals easily accept it. She also questions why the death of animals is not really seen as tragic. She questions who gets to decide what is important and what is unimportant. Is it about physical mass? Is it about numbers? Is it about intelligence? Does common sense get to decide what moves us? She compares the possibility of her cat suffering to the suffering of some of her family members and herself. People suffer, animals suffer. She also discusses sentiment versus intelligence. Yeah, there's a lot. This tiny book touched me immensely. I found her writing to be so relatable and insightful, also incredibly devastating. This is not just about her cat. She adores her cat and she's devastated by losing him. She uses that as a gateway to explore other relationships. But if you have a cat, beware. I would even say that this might be difficult to read for you. Next, I have Ghosts by Edith Wharton. I love a ghostly tale, and I really think this collection is some of the best ghost stories I've ever read. So Edith Wharton is well known for writing like novels of manners, The House of Mirth, The Age of Innocence, but not many people know that she was really well crafted in writing ghost stories. I think the reason why I like these so much is there are no jump scares. She doesn't use like obvious factors to send a chill down your spine. They are subtly written, but they still scare you. You will still look down at the foot of your bed to make sure no one is standing there watching you. The final story, All Souls, was my favorite and a story that I think should be studied. If you want to learn how to write spooky, unsettling prose, study this story. I also like that she utilizes reality to scare the reader. What is scarier than the world's own terror and evil manifested in a glittering pair of red eyes? I included this book as one of my favorites because every story in this collection was worth reading. I don't think that about many short story collections. Typically, they rely on 1 or 2 standouts, and then the rest will feel like filler stories in order to sell an entire book. My overall personal favorites were All Souls, The Eyes, Miss Mary Pask, and Pomegranate Seed. If you happen to be looking for ghost stories, or if you're a fan of Edith Wharton in general, definitely check out this collection. Lastly, I have Angel by Elizabeth Taylor. No, not Elizabeth Taylor, the diamond-loving actress. Elizabeth Taylor, the writer, 2 different people. Angel is about a girl named Angelica Deverell who becomes a writer by being selfish and arrogant. This reminded me a lot of the essay, What Do We Do with the Art of Monstrous Men by Claire Dederer that was published in the Paris Review. Dederer queries maybe every writer is a monster because in order to create art, you have to be incredibly selfish. Despite Angelica's nickname being Angel, she is absolutely not one. As a young girl, she's unpleasant, shallow, arrogant, and she grows up to be the same. As a teenager, she decides that she's done with school. She doesn't get along with the other girls. She wants to have money. How does she get that money? She decides that she's going to write books, and she has no doubts about succeeding. In fact, as a teenager, she tells a doctor about her plans, and he responds by saying, "I hope to read some of your books one day." And she says, that would be up to you. The funny thing is, Angel's writing is not good. The highbrow intellects, they laugh at her books. They're ripped apart by critics. She's writing nonsense, kind of escapism. Books that people read but don't want others to know that they're reading. But Angel likes to think that she is an artist of great literature. As she gets older, she continues to build these delusions about herself and her world. She becomes increasingly unpleasant and unkind. As the reader, you feel frustrated by her. But oddly, you do want to see her triumph. Her determination to have everything that she wants and to pull herself up from her social class just based on her own ability, that's admirable. The ending is interesting. I think it can be interpreted in many different ways. This was my second read by Elizabeth Taylor. I also read Mrs. Palfrey at the Claremont last year, which I also loved. She is such an underrated author, and I really hope more people pick up her books. That's it. Those were all my favorite reads of 2024. I do feel that 2024 was a less successful reading year than previous years. In 2023, I did read some amazing books like East of Eden, Jane, War and Peace. I also finished the Neapolitan novels by Elena Ferrante in 2023, so it's hard to compare the 2 years. Before I go, I also want to share a reading goal for 2025. If you look at the books I read, you would notice I do read a lot of older books, a lot of classics. In 2025, I do want to read more newer releases, and by that I mean books published in like the last 10 years. I want to keep up with what's being published and the amazing writers that are being discovered in my own time period. So any recommendations will be very helpful. If you read a new release and you find it really amazing, please let me know. And I hope you guys have an amazing reading year in 2025. Bye.